Thank you. President Biden?
It's been a terrible thing, what you've done. The fact is that the vast majority of constitutional scholars supported Roe when it was decided. Supported Roe. And that's this idea that they're all against it is just ridiculous. And this is the guy who says the state should be able to have it. We're in a state where in 6 weeks, you don't even know whether you're pregnant or not, but you cannot see a doctor, and have him decide on what your circumstances are, whether you need help. The idea that states are able to do this is a little like saying we're going to turn civil rights back to the states, let each state have a different rule. Look, there's so many young women who have been, including a young woman who just was murdered, and he went to the funeral. The idea that she was murdered by an immigrant coming in. They talk about that, but here's the deal: there's a lot of young women who are being raped by their in-laws, by their spouses, brothers and sisters, it's just ridiculous, and they can do nothing about it. And they try to arrest them when they cross state lines.
This is on me. In my head, that would be funny to watch again, but it was just really sad.
Yeah. I got where he was going. Got where he was going in the beginning, and then I think the thread kind of unraveled like a balloon running out of helium or air, and then by the end it just completely deflated.
Yeah, because I don't even think he knows what he's talking about when he's like, yes, the sisters are raping too and going to make you pregnant.
Yeah, this is like so I think I know what he was trying to do here. It just he really lost control of it. But I think the talking point I'm sure he'd been prepped for was, at some point Donald Trump might bring up this woman who was raped and killed by an undocumented immigrant. So your response here is, what about all the women who are raped who need abortions who can't get them because of because you you appointed the justices who overturned Roe, right? I mean, that's what he was going for, but it just came out in the weirdest possible fucking way. He brought up the woman who was killed by an undocumented immigrant. I hadn't watched the whole debate, so I was thought he was responding. No, Trump had brought it up. Biden brought it up on his own initiative, right? He just heard abortion somewhere. He was like, "Oh yeah, wasn't I supposed to do something here?" Oh right, okay. So, no, wait, I have to set it up now. I've set it up. He brought that up. Nobody made him do that. Right. So he actually which is actually really amazing if you think about this, because on Biden's most winning issue, abortion rights, right? I mean, this is the place where the public most prefers what regular, uninspiring centrist Democrats think to what Republicans think. So this is, Kansas passed a referendum to protect abortion rights, right? Everywhere that it's come up for a vote, it's done well. So this is his best issue, and unprompted, he pivoted to immigration. That's not good. And then as he was trying to get out the immigration thing, he never actually he ran out of steam and ran out of time before he could even connect it back to abortion. I mean, again, if you could kind of see where he was going, you could tell how he was trying to connect the dots. But
Ben's having trouble connecting the dots.
Out of context, he never quite. Why? And also, why aren't we talking about all the women who were raped by their sisters?
Well, we lost you for a minute there.
Yeah, you froze up for a second there, Ben.
But you did come back in time for that final point, and it was perfect.
It was still better than Biden's. It was still much more cogent than what Biden had to say. Yeah, I mean, if that's a major issue in the country, it seems like it might be separate from the abortion issue. I feel like sisters wasn't part of the debate prep. It seems like maybe just an association he made with the word brothers. I'm not 100%. I'm not 100%.
It could also be that
It could also be that Biden was trying to attack Trump from the left on abortion, but he was also kind of trying to attack him from the right on immigration. And he just got so confused because he was like, well, we should have abortions because we don't want Americans to have kids to immigrants. That I think he kind of caught himself maybe before he fully made that point. And then he just kind of stumbled and mumbled and bumbled until he realized that attacking Trump from the right on immigration probably isn't the best idea.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't, I will say, to be fair to him, he wasn't trying to do that at any other point, although there was a lot of defense of how tough he was on immigrants, which, yeah, I mean, look, in general, this was an incredibly unpleasant experience. Andy and I and C. Derek Varn and Deep State Cuba watched it with GTAA patrons and in the Discord, and it was painful, right? It was really hard to get through. And a lot of that was about the fact that Joe Biden, like, if he weren't president of the United States, Hunter and Jill would be having conversations right now about whether it was time to, think about a facility. But, and like, I'm not even exaggerating. Like, I think that like literally might be true. Some of the stuff that's come out in Axios about Biden staffers saying, well, he's pretty cogent until 4 p.m. Like, it's the president of the United States, man. That's not good.
What about that 3 a.m. phone call or whatever that was that Hillary was on about back in 2008?
He's actually gotten up for the day by then, so it's 100% okay. He's just woken up.
Okay.
Yeah, his day is
He's a
from like
morning person, is what you're
yeah,
saying.
it's like 3 a.m. to like 2 p.m. So
yeah, I mean, it's like literally what they're describing as sundowning. That's what it means, right? Like after sundown, right? You're less able to get it together cognitively. So that's obviously the main thing that everybody was focused on because it was so dramatic and striking. But on a political level, what really hit me about this debate is that Biden just kind of had nothing. Like he didn't have a narrative. There was no positive case for why you should reelect him. All I heard basically was some various ad hoc reasons to think that things weren't actually all that bad right now, and Trump is very bad. That's it, right? There's no positive vision. I guess he said something in his closing statement about making the tax code fair in some way or another. I didn't quite catch exactly what he wanted to do there. And doing something about inflation, but like these were not themes that he was hitting earlier in the debate at all, right? And look, it sucks because Trump did have a positive vision. It's a grotesque positive vision, but it exists, right? It's Trump definitely has a case. I mean, the case, if we kind of loosely paraphrase the overall vibe of what he said, Trump's positive vision is more or less vote for me so I can set immigrants on fire on the White House lawn, with a little side of I'm going to be so strong and tough that the other countries aren't going to fuck with us. He said that Putin wouldn't have dared to invade Ukraine if he'd been president. There was a lot of stuff like that. And then there was on the side, I guess he was sort of suggesting that he would hit the economy good again button on the desk in the Oval Office, because he certainly didn't say what exactly he would do. He just said that like the economy was great, and then Biden fucked it up, and then then it'll be good now. So yeah, on both both in terms of the president's cognitive state and the politics of it. It was unpleasant to watch, but I do want to give credit where credit's due. There was one subject where they were both very lively. I think we have a clip.
Thank you. President Biden?
You can see he is 6'5" and only 225 pounds, or 235 pounds. Well, you said 6'4", 200. Well, anyway, that's what anyway, just take a look at what he says he is and take a look at what he is. Look, I'd be happy to have a driving contest with him. I got my handicap, which when I was vice president, down to a 6. And by the way, I told you before, I'm happy to play golf if you carry your own bag. Think you can do it?
That's the biggest lie that he's a 6 handicap of all.
I was an 8 handicap.
Yeah.
8.
Never.
But I have, you know how many?
I've seen you swing. I know you swing.
Okay,
Let's not act like children.
President Trump, we're going to
21
turn.
Let's not act like children.
That's really what they should be arguing about. You right? And
Yeah.
Yes,
like
neither of these people should be running for president, but they should be in some safely contained area arguing about, what their golf handicaps are.
Give them sticks and let them out in the field. I'm okay with that.
So I never said, but I am Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined as always by our super producer, Jake Appett, and our very talented graphic designer, J. Andrew World. We also have super intern Aidan Doyle here joining us today. And this is going to be a crew-only episode because I really want to go over and break down the debate that I did last week. I know that the debate that might make people say, what the fuck was that? For 99.999% of Americans is the one we were just going over. But when I see people say, wow, that was a weird debate, it takes me a second to remember that they're talking about the presidential debate because in my head, right, it's like, oh yeah, right. That was a weird debate. By which I mean the one that I did last Tuesday with YouTube personality Steven Bonnell, better known by the nom de internet Destiny. I want to go over that. So for anybody who is masochistic enough that they want to watch the entire thing straight through, we have the link down there in the description below the box where you were watching us speak right now. But tonight, I at least want to go through the highlights, lowlights, and deeply strange lights of the whole thing. So thank you in advance to you guys for helping to do that. But let's just get right into it, right? So I went first, and anybody who watched this on Destiny's stream actually knows there's a pretty funny reason why. But I went first for the opening statements. So let's start with that opening statement. Thank you. So I know we have very limited time for these openings, but I just want to quickly sketch out why I don't think my country, which is of course also Steven's country, should be supporting Israel. Not in general, and certainly not right now, while Israel is committing really jaw-dropping crimes against the civilian population of Gaza. I have a problem with the last several decades of U.S.-Israeli alliance because I think Israel is an apartheid state, and it's bad to support apartheid states. I realize that apartheid is going to sound like hyperbole to a lot of people's ears tonight. Silly radical leftist stuff. It's probably an exaggeration. But I think it's a simple fact. Israel has ruled over millions of West Bank and Gaza Palestinians for 57 years since Lyndon Johnson was president of this country without giving them citizenship. During some parts of that 57-year period, there's been some level of pretense that this was a temporary military occupation, not a long-term absorption of the territory. But now that pretense is long gone. Israel's current prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has said over and over again that there will never, under any circumstances, be a Palestinian state. In other words, we're never, ever going to leave, and we're never, ever going to give you guys equal rights. We're just going to keep ruling over you as rightsless, non-citizen intervention until the end of time. That's the explicit policy. And of course, even decades before Netanyahu first took office, Israel was building cities of its own citizens on this allegedly temporarily occupied land. Between 5 and 10% of Israeli Jews, depending on which numbers you believe, live in West Bank settlements, about 500,000 people. And what there's been since 1967 has, in essence, been a single apartheid state from the river to the sea. Israeli settlers in the West Bank are considered for every legal purpose to live in Israel rather than living abroad. They vote in Israeli elections when they're accused of crimes. They're tried in real civilian courts, not military courts. their Palestinian neighbors lack all of these rights. And that's the West Bank, where the form the occupation takes is positively soft compared to Gaza. Nobody is dropping 2,000-pound bombs on tent cities full of terrified refugees in the West Bank. Ruling over a huge non-citizen population for decades inevitably leads to a dynamic of dehumanization, where the inevitable resistance, some of which to be sure takes forms I find morally indefensible, is met with increasingly brutal forms of collective punishment of the entire population. So after the most extreme right-wing government in Israel's history took office a couple of years ago, 2023 was the worst year on record for settler pogroms against the non-citizen population in the West Bank. And at the same time, the US and Israel were pushing a strategy of regional normalization at the expense of the Palestinians, which would have taken away the last card Palestinians still had in their hands, which was the nominal solidarity of surrounding Arab states. And unsurprisingly, as the pogroms against West Bank Palestinians were happening and these diplomatic moves were playing out, eventually the more militant of the two main Palestinian factions responded with some atrocities of their own on October 7th. And since then, Israel has responded with atrocities against the entire population of Gaza, the part of Palestine where that faction is concentrated, on an absolutely brain-melting scale. More children have died in Gaza in the last 9 months than in all the war zones in the world for years beforehand. Millions of people, that's 85% of the civilian population, have been displaced from their homes at gunpoint. That's not collateral damage. That's not an oops while you're trying to get to 30,000 Hamas fighters. That's not war as hell. What do you expect? That is, at the very least, ethnic cleansing. And even if I didn't have a bigger problem with my country backing an apartheid state, I'd certainly have a problem with it providing 2,000-pound bombs and diplomatic cover while it carries out crimes reminiscent of what Slobodan Milosevic did in Kosovo and Bosnia. And now I'm curious to hear from Destiny about why he disagrees. So, a pretty straightforward case for why what Israel has had since certainly 1967, whatever you make of what came before that, is a form of ethno-religious apartheid, and why, you know, what's going on now is at the very least ethnic cleansing, right? You know, millions of people, you know, forcibly removed from their homes. And you know that these are things that's bad to support, right? Pretty straightforward. And I ended by saying, now I'm very curious to hear why Destiny disagrees. So, anyone want to enter in any bets as to how long it took for any of those arguments to be responded to?
Never.
I would put my bet on he probably did not respond to any of those arguments.
I mean, eventually some of them, but it took a lot of teeth pulling to, like, you know, recenter the conversation on those initial points to get like any kind of response to you know, to any of it, honestly, right? He goes in a different direction. We've got his opening statement.
Yeah, I imagine a lot of this conversation is probably going to come down to disagreeing over actual facts of the matters about any of the claims that are usually levied towards Israel or Israel's treatment of Palestinians inside or outside of Israel. In terms of why the United States should support Israel, I think there are a host of good reasons. I think that Israel is a good trading partner for the United States. I think that Israel is, for all of its faults, of which, you know, there are a number to point at, I think that Israel is a beacon of democracy in the Middle East compared to every single surrounding country very easily. I think that the standards of living that people in Israel, including the Palestinian citizens of Israel, enjoy, and Israel's adherence to things like rule of law, I think make it a special country in the Middle East. And I think that these are ideas and things that are worth championing for the United States. I think that Israel as an ally in the Middle East provides like a level of stability to that region, and it provides a good military entry point to the United States. It's good access from the Mediterranean to, you know, host ships, host, I guess, whatever else we would need to from that country. Hopefully nothing major in the future. But I think that Israel is also a key strategic ally in terms of intelligence that they collect on U.S. enemies, especially Iran. And I think that Israel probably serves as a good partner for countries like the United States in conjunction with Saudi Arabia against the Iranian axis of Iran and Syria and kind of Iraq. I think that if you care about rights of Palestinians that exist in Israel, I think that it's even more important for the United States to be seen as an ally for Israel, because I think that the United States has been an important partner historically for Israel to push them towards peaceful settlements of issues. Without the United States as a partner, I don't know if Israel would have the same motivations to even consider moving in those directions. I think that the United States also provides an important restriction on Israeli military actions. For some reason, people seem to repeat the rumor that they feel like Israel's army is not conducting itself in a way that's adherent to any rules of law. If you think that, you only have to look to the north, to the east, or to the south to see that there are far, far, far worse ways to conduct war that is probably standard for the region. And Israel very clearly operates far above and beyond any of the norms set by any of its neighbors, including the ones that they're fighting right now. And I think that without any kind of alliance with the United States, I think that I think that Israel would conduct itself probably in a far harsher manner, and I think it would be worse towards everybody in the region, anybody that you'd want to protect. So, yeah.
All right, thoughts.
Well, it seems like beyond the he's going obviously more for the geopolitical strategic reasons, right? Which is, we can open that up. But then the other thing is going to be comparing Israel to other worse actors, right? Versus like maybe some kind of sense of that's how war is fought in that region is basically what his point was, versus like our own ideas about how war should be thought. So I think that I feel like I know that there's some arguments about whataboutism that are coming up later. However you want to define that word, it seems like supporting Israel is often predicated upon comparing it to other states or groups like Hamas that have supposedly done worse. But I feel like whether they have or not is not super indicative of whether the United States should support Israel as it already does. But I am interested in the last point that he made to unpack that Israel would be worse if the United States didn't support it. I think that if it were true, would be interesting, right? I think that would, I think that would actually be a much more compelling road to go down than some of the other stuff. It doesn't really seem true to that's my instinct is that it's not true, but that seems at least a more interesting conversation. But I don't know what you guys think.
Well, yeah, it's always interesting when people who support Israel, Destiny was focusing more on the strategic benefits. And I think that's partially because it's very hard to defend the moral side of it. He did say, it's a beacon of democracy. But if you're putting like strategic benefits over like as more important than mass murder, you do kind of see where the priorities are. And second of all, I think you do have to ask the question, is the strategic alliance between the United States and Israel more beneficial to the United States, or is it more beneficial to Israel? But I think it's, most people would agree that it's far more beneficial to Israel than it is to the United States.
Yeah, I was just looking at the trading, what products come from Israel, which is not a whole lot. There are some, I'm not saying that there's none, but probably disproportionately not equal to what we're importing to Israel. Not just bombs and stuff. I'm talking about other things as well. So like, I don't see how Israel's a good trading partner, especially since we give them so much money.
Yeah. Look, I think that what you even mean by saying that it's a strategic benefit is a little bit murky, because there's a sort of question in the background here about what count as American national interests. Is there such a thing as American national interests, or do different groups of Americans indeed have very different interests, right? Depending on whether you're a worker or a capitalist, for example. That would be the sort of classic left critique. Like one of his examples was about intelligence against U.S. adversaries such as Iran. And of course, the idea that that's just sort of a fact of nature, that Iran as a U.S. adversary is itself something you could question. And, I mean, in fact, detente with Iran and backing off of support for the Israeli state as it's committing atrocities against the Palestinian population would go together fairly naturally as like elements of like a shift towards like an overall less imperialistic foreign policy. I think these were all fairly obvious points, and I suppose we could have wandered down these roads in the debate, but my own move, as we'll see in what follows, is just to kind of make Aiden's point, which is like, look, man, let's just grant all that, fine, right? Like trading partner, blah blah blah. I mean, I don't like. Let's say we'd really be taking a hit, we wouldn't get to use Waze or whatever. That's still like a pretty weak reason to support apartheid and ethnic cleansing, right? Like that's the point that I try very hard to make in what follows, and things get a little strange.
Yeah, let's watch real quick. I think that's, of all the things that he said, I find apartheid and ethnic cleansing so bad that the only thing he addressed that would, the only thing that he said that would address that is, okay, if we didn't support Israel, their apartheid and ethnic cleansing would actually be worse. So that's why I'm like, to me, that's the only locus where we actually, are having an interesting debate to me from someone who, thinks those things are so terrible that like something like trading benefits, I don't know, it's really got to be some good fucking trading benefits, but anyway, let's see where it goes.
Thanks very much for that opening as well. We're going to jump into the open dialogue. Folks, if you happen to have a question, you can submit it if you @ me in the Modern Day Debate live chat. If you do a super chat, that pushes your question to the top of the list. And for this gentleman, shooting for roughly equal time. So if you can do me a favor, keep in mind that the other person will want to speak approximately the same amount as you. And with that, we're going to let you guys kick it off. The floor is all yours for open dialogue.
Yeah, so I basically heard three kinds of reasons there. One is broadly pragmatic reasons that trading partner, intelligence, and one is frankly what sounded to me like a lot of whataboutism, that Israel, as bad as it might be, is at least better than other countries in the region or other places. And then the third was in between, which was the leverage argument that if the United States weren't providing financial and military assistance and diplomatic cover to Israel, then it would act even worse. And I think that last one gets us to why I actually don't know that I agree that the disagreement is going to boil down to sort of fine-grained questions about the fact of the matter rather than inferences and underlying principles. Because it seemed to me that if, I don't know, China were sending massive amounts of military hardware to Russia for the war in Ukraine, and sometimes half-heartedly pushed Russia toward moderating some of their crimes or accepting temporary ceasefire details with Ukrainians, as a Chinese dissident, I don't think you would say that, yep, they should keep sending Russia giant bombs to drop on Ukrainian cities because they lose leverage with Russia if they didn't do that, right? And it also seems, next thing I'd say before throwing it back, that that on that on that general topic, even on a pragmatic level, it seems very implausible that Israel would be as able to hold out for as long as it has away from withdrawing to its 1967 borders if it didn't have this colossus in its corner providing it with military assistance, providing it with that UN Security Council. It does seem very plausible to me that that would that taking that away would make Israel less bold in what it does. But even if it doesn't, even if we can't stop Israel from doing a lot of what it does, then it still seems to me that it's better to at least not help them to commit these atrocities.
Okay, so I guess just two quick things. I really don't like comparisons for Israel-Palestine to other regions of the world because there are so many things that are disanalogous that it makes it difficult for any comparisons to hold any weight. So when we talk as a Chinese citizen for China supporting Russia, and then for Russia to, like, how would we feel as a Chinese person if we thought that China was holding Russia back, but they were still sending them weapons? It's hard to imagine that because Russia is the most aggressive player, like, in that entire region. So it's hard to compare them. Like, if Russia was surrounded by a bunch of far more terrible Russias, then maybe that argument would hold water. But the fact that Russia is, like, uniquely acting in a territorially aggressive way in Europe right now makes it a hard point of comparison to Israel and Palestine is the first thing. And then the second thing, for without support, like, Israel would withdraw to the 67 borders, that military allies or whatever. That's a hard argument considering that we just said we weren't going to engage in whataboutism. But I mean, I would remind the audience that Israel conquered through those 67 borders without really having any foreign allies. So the idea that without foreign allies they would be pushed back, I guess it's possible. But I mean, it's that they are a nuclear power. I don't know if that would be the case. To run down the three different reasons that we gave, I just want to make sure that we're, like, living in the same world here. On the first thing, so we mentioned pragmatic reasons. You brought up the term whataboutism, and then we used the leverage argument. For the first thing, do we agree that there are pragmatic reasons for the United States to be allies with Israel? So pragmatic reasons might be things like they're good trading partners. There's some geostrategic advantage in having, like, a harbor for the Mediterranean, gives us access to the Middle East militarily. Do we agree that those pragmatic reasons exist and are real?
I think that there could be some pragmatic reasons like that are real, although I also think that the United States probably loses a lot from its deeply entrenched alliance with a country that outrages an awful lot of the world an awful lot of the time, particularly in the Middle East. But I'm honestly less interested in that one way or the other than I am in the general question of whether it's good to provide support to an apartheid state. And I know that you're going to disagree with that characterization, but I mean, I kind of laid out the case earlier
we'll get there.
for why the shoe fits. That B is engaged in absolutely massive destruction and displacement against its internal non-citizen population. I think that even if that turned out to be something that that had more pragmatic pluses or minuses from a pure national self-interest perspective, which I'm not actually sure that it does, but even if it did, that still seems like something that people of conscience should be against.
Okay, so I'm just going to return to the first thing for the pragmatic reasons. Do we then agree? Not like there could be, but there are pragmatic. I think we have to.
Okay,
we have to agree here, or we can argue this particular point. Do we agree, for instance, do we trade with Israel?
This is really amazing what he's doing here, because earlier I said, all right, so there's a very, very simple argument in my opening statement. Premise one, Israel has been practicing apartheid, since at least 1967. Premise two, they've been engaged in ethnic cleansing for the last 9 months. Premise three, it's bad to support apartheid states, especially when they're engaged in ethnic cleansing, right? Conclusion, it's bad for the U.S. to support this. Okay, very, very simple argument. No ambiguity, I think, left about what my reasons were. And I said, okay, how long do you think it's going to take us to get to this? You guys haven't seen lots of Destiny comment before, said never. But again, eventually we do, we do make it there, right? After a lot of recentering. But then I said, okay, Destiny's going to go a different way. And of course, look, I know for a fact, as does anybody who's watching his stream, that was not a pre-prepared opening statement. But sure, opening statements, you can just give the argument you think is most important, without responding to the opening statement that came before. But you'd think that, we'd pretty quickly be getting back to those initial considerations. I mean, like, this is the stuff that's like the moral pivot of the debate, right? I mean, that, like, if you think that what Israel is doing is fine, then you clearly must disagree with one or more of those premises, right? And notice that the opposite isn't true, right? It's not that if you have a problem with what Israel is doing in the U.S. role in facilitating it, you therefore must disagree that we trade with Israel, or you must disagree that Israel provides intel to the U.S. military, right? Nothing like that even looks true on its face. And so, I mean, I do have a self-criticism here because I should have insisted on this a lot more than I did. But I did just make an effort in this part to be like, look, man, let's just grant all this for the sake of argument and keep going, right? Like, because none of this is worth getting hung up on, right? This has very little to do with the central point. And again, my self-criticism is I should have stuck with that going forward, right? I do right after this let him get me sucked in for fucking forever to going back and forth about some of this stuff. But his response here is kind of amazing to me, which is, I don't just want you to agree that there might be pragmatic benefits, but that there are pragmatic benefits. You either have to agree with that or we have to go back and forth and establish that. Right? That's what he just said. It's like, what? Why would that be true? Right? Like somebody could have literally any position on any of that stuff that he just said and still think what I think for the reasons laid out at the beginning, right? Like this is the like at best, you might think this adds up to a very, very weak countervailing consideration, right? But like not more than that. So like it is kind of remarkable to me that I made an attempt. Again, I didn't try hard enough. I will definitely take the criticism on that. But I did make an attempt to be like, yeah, sure, let's just say that, right? And keep going and argue about the thing that we actually came here tonight to argue about. He's like, no. We have to eat up this entire open discussion section with me interrogating you about points of fact. And if you if you don't agree, we have to go back and forth about it until you agree, even though none of these points of fact actually touch on the original point.
Should we watch him do that? Excuse me. Should we watch him do that, or should we skip to something a little bit more productive if that exists?
It does exist, as you know, right? You spent the afternoon making clips, but
I kind of blacked out while he was talking, so I'm going to try to focus better this time.
Yeah, it does exist, and we will skip ahead pretty soon. We might keep watching for a little while, but I do want to maybe like just take a minute on one other big thing that's come up in all this before we do, though, which is the whataboutism that, like, he said, I don't know why all these people believe this rumor that Israel isn't conducting itself in accordance with the laws of war, which, one would think, I don't know, man, like read some Amnesty International reports, see what Israel's big human rights organization B'Tselem says, go look at what like UN special rapporteurs, for the region have said, right? You'll find a lot, right? So it was a very confusing thing to say, but then he clarified what he meant by it right after that, which is that he's doing this weird slippage between the laws of war and like grading on a curve for what goes on in the region, right? He said, well, the norms that have been established by Israel's neighbors, that, it conducts itself in a way that at least isn't worse than what other countries in the region have done, which seems really odd to me, right? Like the whole point of having the Geneva Conventions is that we don't think that, well, okay, here's what counts as the laws of war in the Middle East. Here's what counts in Eastern Europe, here's what counts in South America, right? We think, no, here are like standards that every country in the world has to follow. And he's just kind of rejecting that of a piece, saying, no, it doesn't matter because other countries in the region don't follow it. And it just sort of seems like, if so, then we also shouldn't, ship bombs and guns to those other countries while they're committing war crimes. Like, do we have to choose like at least one Middle Eastern country to provide to like funnel massive amounts of military aid to?
He would say yes, I think, right? So that, I mean, but that, that's a little bit interesting, which I know you're kind of joking, but like, I guess like from his perspective and whatever perspective he represents, which I guess is kind of like what, like a sort of a mainstream liberal, American liberal perspective on this, right? Is that we do have to pick. So the implied premise is we have to pick at least like one country there to do this for. So this is not the worst that we could, right? I feel like that's kind of he's kind of just like assuming that is a fact, that we have to do this for one country in the Middle East, that we have to ship them up, right? Because for like the vague, the sort of nebulous strategic concerns, right? So we have to like pick one of them as our allies. So why not Israel? So I guess, yeah, I would question, why do we have, I don't know. It is kind of bringing into a whole other place, right? But
yeah, well, and it's also the other thing that's funny about that, right? If you go with, so Cyber Dandy in the chat suggested that reconstruction of his argument. I will note he never put it that way himself, right? And that would have actually been interesting if he'd explicitly spelled it out in those terms. But yeah, if you go with that, then one, I'd really love to hear the argument to back up that first premise, right? We need to pick at least one country in the Middle East to ship massive amounts of military aid to. And two, even if you accept that premise, that would be completely irrelevant, because as a matter of fact, the United States does that for other countries in the Middle East too, right? Like in the, Saudi Arabia, for example, which is going to come up in a big way later in the debate, right? I don't like that one either, right? But like the U.S. also has a very deep alliance with Saudi Arabia. Most countries in the Middle East are actually American allies at this point, right? So even if you accept the premise that it would be unacceptable to have at least one country in the Middle East that we didn't have an ongoing military alliance with at times that it was at war, it's like, okay, well, we've already got a few others, right? Like, I don't know why we need this, it still wouldn't get you to it needs to be this one. Never mind whatever sort of, background assumptions there are, that there's this thing called the national interest, which is unitary, and, the national interest matters more than human rights, and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I think, Ben, you're overlooking one important fact, is that Israel has white people in it, and those other countries don't. So therefore, inherently, they are good.
Well, I don't know. We're going to watch.
That is where he's kind of getting at, but he's not explicitly saying that. He's
well, you say that, but that's disputed, right? There's just this article about Italy's ruling party where they I think we actually have that headline in the graphics here we go. Sieg Heil's Mussolini songs and Jewish rants anti-Semitism scandal shakes Italian Prime Minister Meloni's party. So there you would definitely get some disagreement with your white people premise.
Okay.
Andrew, I think the better way of saying it is they're a beacon of democracy. That's kind of the new terminology that we're using nowadays.
Okay.
They're a shiny, pale beacon of
they're a white shining pale beacon of democracy.
They get a lot of sun over there, so it reflects off the white. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
I get it. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I remember a couple of years ago, people were mad about Whoopi Goldberg for saying Jews weren't white people, and I never quite tracked down whether the correct answer was yes or no. So we'll let the race science scholars hash that one out.
There was an article like 10 years ago saying that Jews were newly white. Putting
it's very, very important that we all spend our time trying to figure out who counts as an official white person. In fact, there's probably no more important subject. But okay, let's maybe watch just a little bit more of this, and then we'll take pity on everybody and like go to the pre-prepared clips so we can follow like what was actually said about more interesting subjects later in the debate.
do we get like military intelligence from Israel? Are these things that we factually agree on, or do we disagree here? Or
I think that those are both true, but I also think continuing down that would be pretty unproductive, because remember that what I just said is that while I'm not sure that the pluses outweigh the minuses overall, that's not actually, I think, the ultimate source of the disagreement, because if we went over all the pluses in excruciating detail and all the minuses pragmatically in excruciating detail, where we would still be left with at the end of all of that is, okay, if it's pragmatically good for the sake of argument, from the perspective of pure national self-interest, is this something that means that we should just sort of swallow all of the obvious moral objections to doing that, or do those objections still hold water?
Yeah.
Sure. So let's just pause for half a
Germany
second.
Could have been a good trading partner for the United States.
I just want to note that was attempt number 2 to just grant all this for the sake of argument and keep going. But this is granting for the sake of argument was clearly not going to be good enough, right? Stephen really wanted, it's like, no, you have to like earnestly agree with me about all of these things. It doesn't matter how irrelevant you think they are, which is how we ended up spending like an hour talking about, these largely off-topic points. But yeah, sorry, go back to it.
Not saying that just because we trade with them, it necessarily means that, well, now you have to accept my argument. You could accept, for sake of argument, that, yeah, there are pragmatic reasons to be allied with Israel, but there are other issues that we have with the country that far outweigh any pragmatic gain. And maybe even down the road, maybe those become unpragmatic because of how much those like moral crimes, I guess, weigh against us and our support for them in the region, etc. I'm just trying to make sure we're like in the same universe right now in terms of like what we agree on. Do we agree, for instance, that we do trade with Israel, that we export things to Israel and Israel buys them from us? Do we agree that there are like concrete military things that we get, like missile data or intelligence in Iran? Do we agree that these are things that we get from Israel? There are pragmatic reasons to be aligned with Israel. Do we agree just in that one arena? It doesn't mean that that's it. That's the whole argument. There's pragmatic reasons, so we have to do it. But do we just agree that these things exist?
Again, I've got to say, this is a really strange thing to press down on, because I didn't make the slightest objection to any of that earlier, and I think I explained why I don't think that would matter if the pluses outweigh the minuses, and I also think that we're not probably in a great position to figure out if the pluses outweigh the minuses. To me, that's much less clear than the calculus about justice. But sure, do those particular pluses exist? Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they do.
So to macro out a little bit, when I have conversations on this topic, there's a lot of whack-a-mole that goes on. There's a lot of hopping between a ton of different things, and it's hard for people to actually agree like on any actual substance of reality of like what has happened. I'm just trying to hammer down these points so that we have some foundation of agreement. We could agree. We could have an agreement on the next 2 questions that I have, which is about the 3 things you brought up. We could agree on all 3 of those things and still disagree on conclusions. I'm just trying to say that we're in the same world, descriptively, reality. That's all I'm trying to do right now. There's no setup for a gotcha. There's no like, well, since you agreed with this, you have to agree with this. It's merely just saying that we like have the same factual foundation. So we do agree that there are pragmatic reasons to be aligned with Israel. There might be other reasons why we shouldn't be, but we agree that those pragmatic reasons exist, right?
Yes, I agree that we trade with Israel. I'm sure that there's military intelligence
Gotcha.
from Israel. I've never heard anybody deny either of those things.
Okay, that's good. Okay.
Yeah,
So the second point that you brought up, you called it whataboutism, but it has to do with Israel being better than other places. Do you disagree with the fact that Israel is generally better in almost every measurable way compared to basically every other country in the Middle East when it comes to freedom, equal rights, democratic representation of people, standards of living, LGBT stuff, whatever? Or do you disagree with that? Do you think that other countries in this region can make a stronger claim to those things when it comes to the rights that the people are afforded or the representation of those people?
I don't think it matters. I think that the question, Still trying. And this actually gets us back to, since I really do not want to get lost in this, right? This gets back to something you said a minute ago, where you said, "Oh, I don't really like comparing Israel to what's going on with Israel Palestine to anything that's going on in other regions of the world." Because of course there are lots of differences between regions. Like, yeah, of course, there are going to be lots of differences between regions, but I think if you're thinking about general principles and you want to make sure that you're being consistent, you absolutely have to be willing to do those comparisons. So, to directly answer your question, look, I think if you're an Israeli citizen, I think that they are, you all do have more democratic rights than citizens, of various completely non-democratic Middle Eastern countries. I think that if you are a Palestinian living under Israeli occupation, in many ways you probably have less rights than a lot of people do in some of those countries. But I also think that if that's the thing that we're arguing about, we're not actually arguing about what matters, because it could be true that literally every single person in Israel has more rights than every single person in some list of countries, which you think are the only countries that we should bring up when we're thinking about Israel-Palestine because they're close to it. And it could nevertheless be true that the treatment of millions of Palestinians for the last 57 years does fall under any reasonable definition of apartheid, and that it is very, very bad, even in general, that we're aligned with this country. Never mind that we're aligned with this country right now at a time when it's carried out this systematic campaign of destruction of the conditions of normal life in Gaza, and it's displaced literally millions of people.
Okay, I agree that these can all be problems that can supersede any of the agreements that we have here. Again, to reiterate, I'm just trying to make sure that we live in the same world with the same reality. That's the only reason I'm trying to iron out these ground questions so that we don't hop back to them later and that we can build on whatever arguments we both have from here. When I said before, I don't like comparing Palestine to other regions or to other.
This is such an amazing thing to say, because you agree to debate, you spend, couple days of back and forth figuring out exactly the format for the debate, who has how much time to speak when, and then you're like, yeah, I want to spend as much of this as possible just figuring out whether we agree on various empirical background questions that might or might not come up later, just in case they come up, right? This is some of which are literally things that nobody in the history of, nobody in the entire history of Israel-Palestine arguments has ever denied, like the U.S. trades with Israel.
And he says,
go ahead, Aiden. Go ahead.
Well, he just says, when he says why he's doing all this, he says, we just need to get a foundation. This is all just foundational. Well, no, it's not foundational in any way for the other part of the argument. And he can't seem to process that even if you agreed to him and he completely won that part of the debate in every single way, it really wouldn't have any bearing on the actual important part of the debate. It doesn't compute with destiny. You have to move on to what's actually important.
Yeah. I exactly, right? So, we end up.
Sorry, go ahead. I was going to say, I don't think this is you doing something wrong. I think maybe to your point, I wonder if you ever debated him again, or if somebody debates him and he tries to do this. I feel like just hit him with no, yes. Because I think you were trying to, you were arguing that this isn't that important, but then that let him do another stalling tactic, which is to really go on and on about in the meta argument about why it's worth doing what he's doing. Do you know what I mean? So it kind of went in this weird circuitous path. So I wonder if it's just better to just be no, I don't agree. Yes,
yeah, maybe. Yes, although with the no's, then you'd end up arguing about that for 5 minutes. So it's this is why, I think my initial instinct, and I think we already saw me do this at least 2 times, maybe 3 or 4 times. Yeah. My initial instinct kept being to be yeah, sure. Grant that for the sake of argument. That could be true. None of that's relevant. Let's go back to the original issue, and that just kind of didn't work. And so I'm actually not sure. As I'm watching this again, I'm not sure, because my initial impulse was, oh, I must not have tried hard enough to just grant everything, and go back to the original topic. But I'm not sure that as we were watching it, that anything except for just doggedly, I'm not talking about that. Here's what I'm talking about. If any of this shit comes up in a natural way later, feel free to bring it back up. Would have would have worked. I don't know. Maybe if the answers were all yes, I could have just done yes, yes, yes. And then, we would have seen if that led back to the original topic.
Counterpoint. I think Destiny did not prepare to study who you are for the debate. So he's just trying to figure it out right now. Like how Jesse Lee Peterson was trying to size up G tier. Just like, are you a liberal or a conservative?
Yeah, I mean, I did debate Destiny twice in 2019, but that was 5 years ago, and none of that had anything to do with foreign policy. So I think it might genuinely be true. In fact, it often does seem to be true that he's not sure where I'm coming from on this, which is weird because it's spelled out in such a simple, explicit way in the opening statement. But he might have been, distracted or, reading chat or, God knows. But yeah, as this goes on, we end up spending a lot of time arguing about the leverage stuff, with these, some of that's about these very specific micro examples about, it's the most aggressive things that Israel has done were before the U.S. The U.S. was actively supporting it, according to him. And
also until now, right? I mean,
until now, right? Yeah.
No, that's the main. I would just say, I mean, I don't have the list of all of the aggressions that Israel has taken in front of me, but I just really think that we're in kind of that doesn't really seem to stand based on the atrocities that are happening right now.
Yeah, I mean, 1.9 million people forced at gunpoint to leave their homes out of a population of 2.3 million in the West Bank. More children, in Gaza. More children killed in Gaza than in all the war zones in the world put together over the course of the last few years. Even though that's out of such a tiny population. There's I would tend to think so. I also think that the U.S. has been supporting Israel. I mean, it's not like the U.S. was ever arming someone to attack Israel or anything like that, right? But the U.S. has been supporting Israel in the way that it has for decades throughout, pretty much the entire time period that Israel has been holding the West Bank and Gaza, which is a point that I eventually try to make. A lot of this ends up, the reason I said it was a micro example is because a lot of this ended up being us exploring whether it was coherent that on the one hand, he says that he was citing 1967 as an example of Israel being more aggressive before the U.S. relationship was really solidified. But then he also thought that 1967 was a totally justified act of self-defense by Israel. And so at one point I made the mistake of pointing out that it sounded like there was some tension between the things. And then we went back and forth, splitting that hair finer and finer over whether there's some tension. And, that was a mistake. That was me getting distracted by the thing that, he wants to talk about and just being hey man, let's just take this leverage thing for granted. But you wouldn't accept that in any other situation, right? With any country that you agreed was really bad, you wouldn't accept, at least us supporting them in the bad things that we did, made them slightly less aggressive. You wouldn't accept that as a sufficient reason, which is the point that I was trying to make earlier with Russia and China. I should have just said that. So that's, some of this is my fault, although ultimately I think it's a matter of falling for some pretty blatant delaying tactics. But yeah, let's, you know what? Let's just go to the clips. If you, again, anybody who masochistically wants to watch us spend half an hour arguing about whether the U.S. does in fact trade with Israel and exactly what the empirical case looks like on leverage, and not actually arguing about apartheid or ethnic cleansing, can do that. But I do want to actually highlight some of the places where we at least started to talk about interest in subjects. So yeah, we have yeah. So we could do, since Saudi Arabia has already come up a little bit, and the whataboutism point has already come up a little bit. So we could go to Yemen one.
Whataboutism is when you're trying to avoid responsibility by a particular party by bringing up some disanalogous thing in some other party and like appealing to hypocrisy or something when you're trying to hold a particular standard somewhere.
It doesn't have
so
to be
if somebody, if
analogous.
I shoot and kill somebody, okay, and somebody's like, wow, you just killed a person, and I'm like, wait, this person was pointing a gun at me saying they were going to kill me, and you're like, whataboutism? No, that's not whataboutism. That doesn't count.
What I just said. Right?
When Israel is existing in a particular region where there are a whole bunch of actors that are essentially allowed to operate freely in particular ways, whether that means using chemical weapons against their populations, like it had meant for a while in Libya, like it means up in like it meant for a little bit in Iraq, like it means up in Syria, whether that means allowing massive amounts of people, including children, to starve to death, like that might mean in the country of Yemen, like that might mean against opponents for Saudi Arabia that led that coalition against Yemen, whether that might mean massive disenfranchisement of citizens, of throwing them into torture chambers, like that means in Iraq, in Iran, in Lebanon, especially southern Lebanon, or like we can go on and on. I'm just saying that like when all of these,
but none of it would be relevant in any way.
That's great. Okay. When we can go around and we can see how all of the particular actors in this region are acting, right? The actions that you take in a particular region, especially if you don't have security guarantees from the West, are probably to some extent going to have to be in the same language as the actors that are in the region that you're operating in, which is why I don't like to compare like, oh, well, in an ideal democratic world, surrounded by two oceans, what would the United States do? Well, it's a lot different in terms of like, well, what can Israel do? Because they have neighbors that are willing to play by an entirely different set of rules that the United Nations of the rest of the world doesn't hold them to account on. And I think that we have to evaluate that when we figure out like how Israel is going to act, returning us, I guess, to that point of like, why does Israel, if they feel threatened, why does that mean that they take more territory? Well, because holding territory is literally the only way that they can create a buffer between them and their most exposed areas and their feeling, because they don't have those security guarantees from the West, and because the entire region thumbs their nose at UN resolutions. That's the issue.
Yeah. So again, you started out saying that, well, one thing that was wrong but not very important, which is that whataboutism has to involve bringing up disanalogous actions. It can actually involve bringing up perfectly analogous actions, and it's nevertheless whataboutism. If I shoot somebody and then you say, oh, but this other guy across town shot somebody and they got away with it, so therefore I should get away with it, right? That's exactly the kind of thing that whataboutism was coined to describe. Now, you said this isn't like that, because what it's like is you shot somebody but they had a gun pointed at you, but then you proceeded to invoke an awful lot of examples that don't involve a gun pointed at Israel. They involve terrible things being done to other people that don't threaten Israel in any way. In some cases, even by countries with some level of security cooperation, or certainly at least common allies.
Okay, well then I mean, if we look then at
the question is always, right, when people bring up crimes committed by other countries in whether in the region or otherwise, that crimes not committed against Israel, right, but crimes committed against other people in discussions of crimes committed by Israel, then the question is always, okay, are you saying, well, they get away with that, so therefore Israel shouldn't shouldn't worry about international law, shouldn't worry about this? I mean, I would say that, for example, one of your examples was the Saudi war in Yemen, which was...
Okay, we don't have to get into the Saudi stuff.
Which is a little funny to me how eager he was to not talk about the Saudi war in Yemen when it was brought back up, and in fact, in Yemen too, he's even less eager.
You should have said, so Steven, just so I understand that we're on the same page, do you agree that there is a Saudi war in Yemen, and that and just made him agree to like 15 things? I guess looking back at it, it is kind of just like making your opponent
say, yes, I agree to all of your points. in the guise of let's just make sure that we agree. You know what I mean? Because those are his main points that he wants to talk about, and he's just making you say yes to all of them. But anyway, let's move on from that though. From the stalling.
Yeah, but then he could go, but Ben, you said you agreed with me. Why are you disagreeing with me now? Aha, I got you. Take that.
Yeah. And then Yemen too is pretty much a continuation of this.
Yeah, and he was really wrong about he just completely misdefined whataboutism, didn't he? By invoking the concept of self-defense. But that's different.
Well, I mean, to be fair,
I think I might be missing what he said.
To be fair, I think one of the I mean, he did completely misunderstand whataboutism at the beginning, but then his misunderstanding was that whataboutism had to involve bringing up somebody else doing something that's not really analogous. And of course, it doesn't have to be something that's disanalogous. It could actually be a really good analogy, right? But the point is, what makes it whataboutism is you're saying, oh, well, you're objecting to this, even though this other person did this, right? Like, I mean, the classic, like, whataboutism is, if you say, like, I don't know, the classic thing is like the sort of apologist for Stalin, right? Who'd be like, oh, you're criticizing, human rights in the Soviet Union while you're lynching Negroes in the United States, right? I mean, that was like the classic one. It's not that like lynchings weren't real or bad, right? Like they were and they were, right? It's just sort of irrelevant to the point, right? Like, or if you say, I don't know, like if you say, oh, you criticize Russia for invading Ukraine, but then, America invaded Iraq. It's like, yeah, but both of those could be bad, right? Like you don't have to say, like, you don't have, like, the fact that, other things that are also bad have happened doesn't take anything away from the criticism. So that was the misunderstanding. But, but then, to be fair to Steven, I think the thing he was saying about self-defense was the other way around. He was saying it's not whataboutism because it's self-defense, or rather, I mean, he was saying something in the neighborhood of that. He was saying, there are all these other countries that are in the region that are acting in such a dangerous way, right? That like these are the people that Israel has to deal with, so it has to like play by rougher rules, right? I mean, that was roughly his argument.
Oh yeah. Well, that right. So that part was where he was getting more into real substance, which is he's saying that Israel has to commit what we would on an international stage consider war crimes, right? Or the UN might consider war crimes or violating Geneva Convention because the countries around it are violating the Geneva Convention, right? So from a pragmatic point of view, that's what Israel has to do to defend itself. That's basically what he was saying, which is a much more substantive argument, unless I'm misreading what he said. But that seemed to be like an actual, not just hemming and hawing argument.
Yeah. So the not just hemming and hawing argument is, it's like a classic like bit of Zionist rhetoric, that you talk about what a rough neighborhood Israel.
Of course, you have to carry a knife on you. Mom, I need to carry this knife. It's a rough neighborhood. Yeah.
Isn't that the same argument that Kyle Rittenhouse gave? Like why he had to shoot those people?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Kyle Rittenhouse thing is a little bit. I think to call balls and strikes here, I think that I actually do think that like in the moment he probably did have a self-defense claim. The bigger issue is like why he put himself in that situation. To begin with, right? Like, and that is actually something where, I kind of take the L.
I mean, you can make the same argument about Israel. Like why did they move their troops away from the rave they're having outside the concentration camp to let Hamas come in and do that so that they have to defend themselves by killing a whole lot of people? Like that's just like Kyle Rittenhouse, right? Am I wrong? Am I?
I don't know. I'm kind of missing the analogy here a little bit,
Okay.
but
Maybe I'm not explaining it well. That's fine.
But I think but that is really the important claim to have to defend, and obviously he didn't. I'm sure that he didn't really let this be the point. But because most people say, hey, listen, Israel's not perfect, but Israel has to do these slightly bad actions, although they are going to argue about to what extent they're bad, right? Like they're going to say, hey, there are civilians being killed, but they're not being targeted, yada, 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 right? I'm just trying to steel man it a little bit. But what I'm saying is that, sorry, there's a thing going off my house. But what I was saying is that the whole point that they have to make is that these actions are actually beneficial for Israel as well and beneficial for the world, right? That like the war that Israel is currently undertaking in Gaza is actually benefits even Israel's self-interest, right? That's part of the point, that this is what they need to do to root out Hamas, which, human rights issues aside, which is I know that's the main thing you want to argue, but that's not necessarily true either, which is really frustrating. I think there's a lot of evidence out there that Israel is not going about actually rooting out Hamas in a very strategic way, right? And all of this is just, there's just a lot of killing for killing's sake going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think there's a lot of reason to think that ethnic cleansing is the point. There are various members of Netanyahu's cabinet, and people always get into these weird arguments. Oh, actually, Minister of National Security isn't that important cabinet post. But there are all these people in Netanyahu's cabinet who have openly said that they think that the long-term end game is mass resettlement outside of the territory. And none of those people have lost their cabinet positions for saying that. Netanyahu himself has said some things that I think you can plausibly argue are at least sort of a wink and a nod in that direction. And certainly I think their actions make a lot more sense if you think that's the end game than rooting out Hamas, because we just like the idea that sort of blunt force counterinsurgency is going to do that, I think is kind of ridiculous after what we've seen in the last couple decades of America's wars in the Middle East. We spent literally 20 years destroying the Taliban in Afghanistan, and the Taliban was conspicuously undestroyed by the end of it. I would argue that similarly, it's extremely unlikely that destroying the conditions for any kind of normal Palestinian life in Gaza and creating a sort of deep well of bitterness among the population there is going to have this effect of destroying Hamas. I think that realistically, just given some baseline facts about human nature, it would actually be more likely to be a recruiting bonanza for Hamas or whatever comes after Hamas, because people who've seen their siblings, parents, aunts, uncles killed or dismembered in front of them are going to have every incentive in the world to join Hamas or some successor organization. So that'd be my argument on that. But also I think Steven's argument isn't even that, right? It's not like, at least in that, I'm sure it is that in other places, but in that clip that we just watched, right, I don't think it was even that. I think his argument in that clip was, Israel has to do this because it's surrounded by all these dangerous neighbors and it can't afford not to carry a knife in this bad neighborhood, right? Like that's essentially the argument. And my point was, well, hold on, but you're mentioning a lot of things, and he even used the analogy, it's not whataboutism, because it's not whataboutism to say I shot somebody who was pointing his gun at me, right? That's the self-defense line. But then he's supporting that by bringing up all these examples of guns that are not in fact pointed at Israel, right? They're pointed at other people, right? Like Yemen and in the Saudi Arabia case. And so, in fact, they're being supported, that they're being not only not directed at Israel, right? They're not part of any kind of threat to Israel that would justify Israel's actions. They're being carried out by countries that have, again, some level of security cooperation with Israel in many cases, at least informally, certainly common allies, right? Like Saudi Arabia is a close U.S. ally. And the point I was trying to make at the end there, when then he saw where I was going and cut me off, was, look, yeah, let's talk about Yemen, right? Because this is actually a pretty close analogy to what's going on in Gaza. That you have, what I think many people rightly said were genocide level atrocities being carried out by Saudi Arabia in Yemen, and the U.S. was supporting that, and it shouldn't have. And all the reasons why the U.S. shouldn't have supported that also apply to it being bad for the U.S. to support Israel doing similar things in Gaza, right? And so there is actually a deep consistency on the side of the anti-war left, which has opposed both of these things, which is the point that I was trying to make. So we have a second Yemen clip where I go back to that.
67 is obviously one of our most contentious wars, right? And you talk about like, well, the self-defense thing doesn't count. Do we agree?
No, I didn't say that. I have this is, again, I don't think anything that would be true about 1967, 1973, 1956, Sinai. I don't think any of this stuff would be relevant to, is it acceptable to rule over millions of people for 57 years without giving them equal rights because of their ethnicity? And is it acceptable for the United States to support a country like that? And is it acceptable for the United States to support a country that has displaced millions of people in the last 9 months? That there could be literally anything that was true of those things. And nevertheless, the answer to both of those questions would be no, just like to do those 10 seconds, just like, yes, it's terrible that the United States was back in Saudi Arabia during while it was committing those atrocities in Yemen. I mean, I think that the left was, almost the only people who were speaking out against that at the time. Bernie Sanders.
Okay, we're not getting into all this.
But this is the point. Just the same, applying the same standards.
Now you're stalling for time.
Yeah, it's so funny that he's saying you're stalling for time when he went through like an hour of just, do we agree on this? Do we agree on this? Do we agree on this? Like,
yeah, and the point that I just about managed to get out at the end there as he's heckling as hard as he possibly can was actually really central to the overall point of the debate and the sort of central issues and contention between the two of us, and also kind of the absurdity of what he's saying, because he's happy to bring up Yemen as an example of Arabs being bad. Right? Like that's, remember, he's the first one who mentioned the war in Yemen. And the reason he was bringing it up was as an example of what a bad neighborhood it is. Right? Like, oh, check out like how, barbaric these Arab countries are in their actions. And then, I was trying to make the point that, look, the people who have triggered you so much on Israel-Palestine, right, the anti-war left, were also like the only people who are opposing that. And in fact, this is almost a one-to-one analogy, right? All of the same human rights reasons why we should oppose U.S. aid to Israel as it's carrying out atrocities in Gaza are also reasons why we should oppose Israel carrying out, Saudi Arabia carrying out atrocities in Yemen. And in fact, right, like for all of the diarrhea of whataboutism that we got over the course of this debate, in fact, we did oppose U.S. aid to Saudi Arabia as it was carried out these atrocities in Yemen. I mean, other than there are like 3 libertarians who are good on foreign policy who were talking about it, like Dave Smith was talking about it, right? But otherwise, who besides the exact same anti-war leftists that Stephen hates so much were talking about how bad it was for the U.S. to support the Saudi war in Yemen? Again, Bernie Sanders, led this bipartisan effort to cut off U.S. aid to that war. So, I mean, that seems like an incredibly relevant point of comparison.
Yeah, for sure. I was thinking also, someone kind of alluded to it in the comments, but the relevant analogy to the neighborhood thing is probably like you live in a rough neighborhood, so then you start like killing everyone in the neighborhood. Like you buy a knife and then you just start killing everyone in the neighborhood. You know what I mean? So they
Yeah, is that going to make the neighborhood safer?
Right. Like I think that is a lot more about like what's going like that is the rough neighborhood analogy that makes sense. I think, you know, that like it might be temporarily safer for you while those, you know, because those people are dead, but are maybe, you know, maybe their friends and relatives are going to go after you. But anyway,
it's like the Death Wish movies is what you're saying, you know?
yeah. That's the rough neighborhood. But is there some other stuff we want to get to? Because I know we do have a few other.
Yeah. Okay, so we do have a few places where he actually does he actually does address, to be fair, right? I mean, it took a lot of recentering, right? But he actually does address, and we actually do end up arguing about, right, some of those initial considerations about apartheid and ethnic cleansing. So let's maybe do the Israeli Arabs 1 clip.
I would submit that it is incredibly clear that the citizens of Israel, whether you're Palestinian or Jewish, enjoy much greater freedoms, much greater rights, much greater economic opportunity, much greater educational opportunity, basically in almost every single conceivable way, setting aside the people in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip at the moment, than any other Arab in any other surrounding country. I feel like that's like almost impossible to contest, but it seems hard for people to give that. I'm just curious if you feel the same, or if you feel like you can also say that, like, well, sure, I guess it's true, but it's not really relevant to any of the arguments we're about to make. That's fine as well. But I'm just curious if you agree with that or disagree with that, or.
Yeah. So again, if the question is about comparison, and it's really important that we sort of keep track of the boundaries you put on this comparison, because I think all the action is going to be on the other side of those boundaries. So if we're comparing, sure, standard of living, rights, freedoms of Israeli citizens, Jewish or Palestinian, to people in just the countries that you're willing to compare them to. Yes,
to be clear, those are countries in the region.
Well, hold on though, right? Like I do want to, because you said a bunch of things. I want to make sure none of them get lost, right? So because that is like a much bigger disagreement that we're having here, whether only other countries in the Middle East get to be relevant. And I think that's a good way of not applying consistent standards, to only take into account other countries in the Middle East. But yes, if we're only going to count other Middle Eastern countries and we're only interested in Israeli citizens, then I think all of that is broadly true. I mean, this is, and I don't think that's a concession. I think that's just a separate point.
Yeah, none of these are concessions, by the way. I'm just seeing if we agree on these points. That's it. Yeah.
Sure. I'm just trying to make sure people can track like how this relates to the original argument, right? Because this is a super common talking point. Essentially, the what about the Israeli Arabs argument against the kind of critique of Israel that I laid out earlier. And whereas if you stop just comparing the Palestinian citizens of Israel to only people who live in various dictatorships and monarchies nearby, and start comparing them to people, to minority groups in Western democracies, I think in many ways you do see significantly more, discrimination in the Israeli case. And we can certainly talk about that, but I think that that's a little bit beside the main point, because the two things that I said earlier, right, that I think that the reasons why I'm bothered by our country supporting Israel are the charge of apartheid and the charge of ethnic cleansing in the last 9 months in Gaza. And of course, neither of those are about the Israeli Arabs, right? Those are about Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza for the first one, and mostly Palestinians in Gaza for the second one. And it's true, right, that there is this population of Palestinian families who ended up on the Israeli side of the line after 1948, who were eventually, granted most of the same rights as Israeli Jews. But it doesn't follow from that. And I know you're not saying it is, but I really just want this to be clear for the larger point, right? It doesn't follow from those people not having been denied these rights on the basis of their ethnicity, that there aren't millions of other people in Greater Israel, right? Israel's existed since 1967, who are denied basic legal rights on the basis of their ethnicity, quite openly on the grounds that even while Israel is building cities full of its own citizens in there, even while a significant percentage of the Israeli Jewish population is moving there, very explicitly on the grounds that if we granted all of these people citizenship, then that would take away the Jewish character of the state. So we can't do that. So to my mind, this is a little bit like saying, yeah, you could vote if you were a black person in New York State in 1940, therefore, no one in the United States in 1940 was denied the right to vote because they were black. I mean, there are people who have these rights in Israel despite being Arab, but there are also millions of people who are denied these rights because they're Arab. And then we have a follow-up where this comes back up later in the debate. Yeah, again, I'm still waiting for the non-essentialist reason to think that the treatment of Jews in theocracies and dictatorships and monarchies is a good guide to how Jewish people would fare in a democratic republic that was, had somewhat of an Arab majority, although actually, if you just gave everybody citizenship, tomorrow there would be approximately equal numbers of Arab and Jewish citizens. Judaism would still be the plurality religion in the country, and again, it seems to me, yeah, I don't think that theocracies, dictatorships, monarchies, these are good models for having lots of rights for minorities, but I also don't see any non-essentialist reason to think that therefore a democratic republic with approximately equal numbers of Arabs and Jews would be one where the current realities are reversed and there's ethnic cleansing of Jews or they're brutally repressed or anything like that.
Jumping into this next
Yeah,
one.
It's a non-reading of history. That different people can have different cultures. There doesn't have to be anything that's racially essentialized for that. The Palestinians that live in Israel have a higher affinity towards democratic governments than the Arabs that live in other states, especially under the monarchies in the Gulf, especially under the dictatorships in North Africa and in the wider Middle East. Like, yeah, you don't have to have a racial essentials argument. You can't bring it. You can't keep saying every single time somebody asks you, what are the Muslim majority or Arab majority countries where Jews live happily? You can't just keep crying, oh, you're being racist. Oh, you're being racist. Like most Muslims and most Arabs in the Middle East would tell you, yeah, fuck them. We don't want them to have equal rights. They don't deserve it. Either our religion demands that they don't, or the history that we've suffered as a result of the Nakba, as a result of them intruding on our continent, as a result of them, leaving us over encumbered with all the other shit we've dealt with, whether that's enemy dolphins or pigeons or whatever the fuck that they're blaming on Israel now. A lot of them would say, no, fuck these people. We don't want them here. There's nothing racially essentialized about that. Different people have different histories. Sometimes they have different cultural components to why they believe things they do. And there are particular cultures that run in different parts of the world. No part of that demands that any particular person be racist. It's just a ridiculously stupid way to dodge the question of like, well, which Muslim or Arab majority country should have Jews ever lived happily under?
Okay, so we do have my response to that, but before we play it, I just want to note that if you got one thing out of that response, it's that Steven was very, very offended at the suggestion that what he was saying was essentialist. So just to back up and contextualize this a little bit, right? So again, I argued in my opening statement, and after heroic efforts for like an hour and a half, managed to get him to argue about whether what Israel had done since 1967 was apartheid. That Israel has ruled over millions of people in territory that's been absorbed into Israel for every purpose except for this one, without making them citizens. Because if they were citizens, then that would lose the Jewish character of the state, right? That's the usual Zionist argument for not doing that, right? For, that like it would be a terrible thing to have a single, democratic secular state. And Destiny says, oh, no. But if you did that, then Jews would be oppressed and maybe even kicked out. Because after all, what are the Arab or Muslim countries where, where there's like equality for everything, everybody, and everything's great? And then I said, hey, saying that if there was a democratic republic with approximately equal numbers of Jewish and Arab citizens, which is the proposal under consideration, that would therefore lead to Jews being horribly repressed, or maybe, the ethnic cleansing going the other way. Like, it seems like the fact that people don't have full equality in various monarchies and theocracies is a very weak reason to think that. It seems like the only reason to think that is some sort of essentialism. Essentialism just meaning that you think like all Arabs are the same, right? That's what essentialism means in this instance, right? So essentialism is when you say, oh, there's some demographic group, right? Racial, religious, cultural, linguistic, whatever, and they just kind of all are a certain way, right? Because that's like the essence of that group, right? This is the sort of thing that I always talk about, is like acting as if there's like a Palestinian hive mind, for example, that people don't have all sorts of different opinions and, all of this stuff, right? That like, oh, this is just what you should expect because this is just what that group is like. Okay. The reason I'm belaboring this is in this clip that we just watched, Steven is very offended at my use of the word essentialist to describe his position. And I want you to keep that in mind when you watch the clip that we've got here labeled "Not to Trigger."
Sorry, that's my bad. I got lost in the sea of clips. Okay, here it is.
Not to trigger anybody, but to look at the historical record. It's just kind of always been the reality is that the Palestinian people historically and truly the neighbors as well just don't want Israel or Jews to exist there as a people that have a country. That's just kind of been the case from the start. The idea that it's actually some thing that Israel is doing is what's making these people not like them is just not true. Again, from the very beginning of the existence of Israel, as soon as they started to basically pour onto that continent, all of the Arabs in the region were like, we do not want you here. We do not want you to have a state here. We do not want you here. Please fucking leave. Nasser said, to the trade unionists, this is going to be a war of annihilation. If it comes to this, we will destroy every single, all of Israel. Again, anything else is just like I think it's just a red herring. This has always been the intention from the start. The idea that we can't engage in some war because it'll radicalize the people there. That's a thing that only a Western person could say. The idea that you would posit this to an Arab, like, oh wow, do you guys hate Israel because of something? They'd say, no, we don't ever want this country here. We've never wanted this country here. If you ask an Israeli, do you think that if you guys just stop at this, that the surrounding Arabs would all love you? They would also love it. Say, no, they've hated us since we've been here for the past 100 years, and when we've existed in their kingdoms before that. So no, I think it's obviously you should be mindful of like how you could radicalize people, or your conduct might lead to further problems on the road. These are things you should obviously be concerned about. But the idea, this like fantastically delusional, white Western mind of like, oh well, if we just turn this one thing off, everybody, will get in their Sunday suits and go and vote for democracy and respect the equal rights of everybody. It's just kind of like a Western delusion, a projection of our modern system, onto other countries that might not necessarily have people that share those same values at this particular point in time.
I mean, this is nothing but pure uncut. Like, the Arabs are all just like that.
Yeah, I mean, he because he says like, it's just this Western liberal delusion or whatever, and he says, oh, his like feint toward rationality is, well, of course, that's one factor that we should consider, but it's not as if. And then the as if is basically, can't even think of the right logical fallacy right now, but the as if, right, is like, oh, they're all going to put on their Sunday suits. And yeah, that's obviously another extreme that would never happen. The truth lies somewhere in the middle between two different poles, right? In terms of like, are we fomenting violence or reducing violence? You know what I'm saying? It's kind of like he's it's really not fair what he's doing, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, what he's doing is he's saying that the reason that Palestinians or other Arabs resent Israel has nothing to do with anything Israel has done, right? It has nothing to do with the Nakba, right? hundreds of thousands of Palestinians being driven out of the country in the initial ethnic cleansing in the late 40s, and those families never to this day being allowed to come back. It's not about millions of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza being held under permanent military rule without basic rights. Like, all of that's just a coincidence. Even if, can you hear me?
You're a bit frozen, but I can hear you, but you're frozen with your eyes closed.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that I'm frozen. So
his voice, which is great.
I'm just gonna ride it out, I suppose, on that. I'll yeah, no, even that didn't help. That's actually kind of amazing that it didn't.
If you want, we could go ahead. I was gonna say, what after you make this point, we could play a few clips and see if you want.
Yeah, we could do that. But like he's saying that he's saying that like that's just all a coincidence. If in a world where there was no ethnic cleansing, no 57 years of keeping millions of Palestinians under military rule without basic rights or self-determination, people would hate Israelis just as much, because this is just the nature of like Arab culture, that you can't expect these people to put their Sunday suits on and vote for democracy. That's something only a white Westerner would think. I mean, this is just classic colonialist rhetoric, right? That's like, oh, this could be like somebody, this could be a French officer talking about Vietnam in the 1930s, that's like, oh, you don't understand the Oriental mind, right? You think that they think like Europeans, but really they're just these completely different kinds of people. And so in any case, I think that the sort of explosion of essentialism in that statement, to my mind at least, makes it very funny that, that he resented that word being applied so much. But let's look at the Israeli Arabs 3 clip. I also just want to point out the sheer absurdity in pointing out, as Stephen keeps getting triggered by the word essentialism. He's adding racial. I didn't say that, but they have by the word essentialism, that in his defense, he is saying, oh, well, these 2 million Israeli Arabs, those actually are people who aren't going to act this way because they're going to have this predilection toward democracy. Well, if so, that's because they've been awarded democratic rights for decades, which I'm suggesting extending to millions of other people. Also, those would be 2 million people toward the total that would get you approximately equal numbers of Jewish and Arab citizens if they gave everybody citizenship. So I don't understand how, for the purposes of defending himself against the charge of essentialism, those people are, nice and pro-democratic, but for the purposes of counting them towards a possible Arab majority in the future, they can't be trusted because, after all, Jews have been oppressed in other Arab and Muslim countries in the past. All right. I don't know what's going on with the camera, but we are just going to do this for a minute because that's apparently the deal right now. So yeah, this is this is kind of amazing to me that again, Stephen, I think, hears the word essentialism, and all he hears is, oh, he's accusing me of being a racist, but I'm not a racist, because I don't think it's like genetic. But this really has nothing to do with anything, right? I mean, if you say, oh, black people are lazy and criminal because that's just like some deep fact about black culture, you're not doing biological racism, right? You're attributing it to culture. But you're definitely essentializing like a huge group of people and saying, oh, they're all just kind of like that because they just have, just by virtue of being that demographic group, they're just determined to act in this way, right? If you say, oh, I don't know, Jews are greedy and and devious and blah blah blah, you do all the anti-Semitic stereotypes. But you say, oh, but that's because of Jewish culture, right? It's not because of some genetic fact about Jews. I'm sure if we force them to convert to Christianity and, raise them in Christian homes, they'll be fine, right? Like, again, you're not doing biological racism, but you're still essentializing vast groups of people in ways that are silly, right? That are not rational ways to think about how about like what's going to explain human action, right? That like this is this like really, yeah, it's just about the it's just about like the sort of innate features of this group of people. It has nothing to do with the history that like the ethnic cleansing, the decades and decades of keeping Palestinians under military rule while cities full of Israeli citizens are being built on the same territory, etc. I mean, that's again, that's silly. That's essentialist in much the same way that if you say, oh, there's a higher black crime rate than a white crime rate, not because there's a higher black poverty rate, but because of deep facts about black culture, you're doing kind of ridiculous cultural essentialism. And I think it's particularly incoherent given that he says, oh, Israeli Arabs have more of an affinity for democracy than other Arabs. It's like, well, what would be the difference be, right? The only difference between Israeli Arabs, the people you call Israeli Arabs, and West Bank and Gaza Palestinians is that citizenship and equal rights were given to the Israeli Arabs. Because culturally, you're talking about the same people, oftentimes, in fact, the same families separated, by the 1948 war.
It's all true.
And excuse me. And also, like, it's true when Destiny brings up the point, oh, the Israeli Arabs have a higher standard of living than any other like Arab country. Well, for one, we can talk about like the civil wars or the American intervention that's ravaged other countries in the region, but it's also kind of part of the same racist colonialist rhetoric that early Zionists use when they say we're gonna bring like civilization and culture to the Arab world. And we know, I know, Ben, you didn't want to touch on this because you want to focus on the main argument, but you've talked about this before, and we're all aware of it, that Israeli Arabs are not really equal citizens in Israel. Like, there are tons of things, land allocation, the Emissions Committee law, like laws that bar them from exercising, like torture laws, for example. Tons of laws that really make them second-class citizens in Israel. And Destiny's basically saying, well, it's better for Palestinians to be governed by Israel than it is for them to be governed by themselves, because look, we've brought civilization and Zionists from Europe brought like all this amazing stuff. It's just it's pure racism.
Yeah. I mean, we actually did a whole thing on last week's show when I was getting ready to do this about the Israeli Arab issue. And I actually had a ton prepared on this for the debate, because actually, really, that's the thing that I should be the most angry about. That, like, I spent all day last Tuesday sort of trying to come up with everything that I thought you could possibly throw at me, and like, taking all these detailed notes about it. And then it's like, we spent like half of it talking about, do you agree that Israel trades with the United States? And, what are the, what's the exact breakdown of all the times that the U.S. might or might not have exercised leverage and all this stuff. So we kind of never, like a lot of the stuff that I'm playing for you guys now actually came up in the Q&A. And that's why we're sort of doing disconnected clips. Here's where Steven says it, and then here's 5 minutes later when I have a chance to respond as part of an answer to some other question. But yeah, I mean, certainly on the Israeli Arabs, what we mentioned last week, and I would have, been very, like, I kind of say a couple things in the clips we just watched, like, well, most of the same rights, right? Because I wanted to kind of briefly signal the fact that, in fact, saying that Israeli Arabs have equal rights is a wild overstatement, right? But then he never really pressed on that, so we never really got into it. But yeah, you're totally right. And I mean, they certainly, like, a big chunk of the land in the country is controlled by the Jewish National Fund, which openly discriminates, right, in who it leases land to, unabashedly, right? Certainly restrictive covenants. of the kind that used to be legal in the U.S., right? Oh, you can't sell this, like when you buy the home, right? You're agreeing to the restrictive covenant. You can't sell it to like a black person or a Jewish person. That kind of thing is still legal, very much so in Israel, right? Like there's lots of housing, segregation of that kind. And also there are lots of Israeli Arab politicians and political parties who have been barred from participating in elections because they're too anti-Zionist. And so Israel's election commission kind of acts like a, Zionism guardianship council, essentially, right, on the Iran analogy, and has barred lots of them. There have been lots of court cases about this, etc. So I think all that's true. The reason that I wasn't, I had stuff prepared if it came up, but the reason I wasn't sort of going to that is that if it were, if that were all that were the case, right, then I still think that would be totally unacceptable. But at least Stephen's point stands that, well, you might still have more rights as like a just, person who's a citizen of something that's a democracy if you ignore the West Bank and Gaza, and who's discriminated against in various ways, but you still have more rights than you have in various neighboring dictatorships and, theocracies and monarchies. It's like, okay, sure. Right. But the larger point is you have all these millions of people who are denied citizenship rights because of their ethnicity. And, that's really, I think, the core point about apartheid.
Yeah. I think the other interesting thing, too, is, kind of going back to Aiden's point was I looked this up. The Human Development Index, which ranks countries by their standard of living, with multiple things, puts Israel at 25 on the list of this is including the 69 very high human development countries, and interesting enough, United Arab Emirates is number 17, and there's a bunch of other Arab countries listed in the very high index, including no, I'm not saying Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and a few more. So I find that his argument, like what does he think that the Middle East is like? It's just like Lawrence of Arabia, Stargate type living conditions, and then you go to Israel and it's like New Jersey.
Well, that last part maybe a little bit, but yeah. I mean, I suppose his argument there would be a lot of those countries. Sure, if you're like, if you're like Qatari, for example, right, you do have that higher standard of living, but they have all of these. There's like some of these countries have huge populations of guest workers who live in really awful conditions, right? But of course, if you did make that argument, it'd be pretty funny because like that would pretty closely parallel the point about the Palestinians, right? That like
exactly,
Israel, people have all these rights and high land standard of living unless you ignore, as long as we pretend a few million of them don't count. Okay, we have a few more clips that I do want to get to before we go to the post game. So I don't know. Do you want to do super heavy? These are like super heavy questions. That one.
That puts a lot of pressure on you guys because these are like super heavy questions. But Dee, thanks for your question, says, why did you once state Israel would have to genocide the Palestinians, and why do you let's see. And they say, we want to know an answer.
This is a comment I made, I think, like a month before the October 7th conflict happened. I basically said that like it seems like the only end to this is going to be one side killing the other because it seems like there was no other resolution because there was no peace process to be had. I don't think that either side should genocide the other side. If you watch that full clip, like more than the 30 seconds I posted on Twitter, I literally say afterwards, it's a shitty situation and it seems like it's only going to end when one side eliminates the other. Obviously, that would be unideal, although I think that people like Ben would say that the destruction of the state of Israel and the occupation of it by an Arab majority that might lead to the mass expulsion, pogroming, or genociding of the Jews is like an acceptable outcome. But I don't think any side should be genocided.
Yeah, Stephen obviously knows that what he just said is a lie. Obviously, I don't support the expulsion of anybody. What I support, what I think would be the most just outcome would be Israel turning into a regular multi-ethnic democracy with equal rights for everybody who lives within the borders that it's been in for the last 57 years. So equal rights for Israeli Jews, Palestinian Christians and Muslims, Thai guest workers, everybody. If that's too utopian, the very least they could do would be to withdraw to their 1967 borders. But of course, I don't support expelling anybody. I'm certainly not the one in this conversation who's defended evicting millions of people from their homes.
Yeah, no notes. That was great.
So this interesting piece of mind reading that you get in this clip that Ben would think that it was great if the ethnic cleansing were reversed and Israeli Jews were mass evicted, which by the way is fucking funny because viewers may recall, like if your memory stretches back to the spring,
A long time ago.
yeah, I know. But viewers may recall that I wrote an article for Jacobin called "No One's Rights Should Depend on Where They Live." No one's rights should depend on where their ancestors came from, where their ancestors lived. There we go. I knew lived was in there somewhere. Where I actually criticize people who would like refer to all Israeli Jews, even if they live in Tel Aviv, as settlers or colonizers, and made the point that I think that the sort of best way to criticize Zionism isn't from a perspective of, oh, this is like the wrong ethno-national narrative, you should pick up some other one instead, but just from the standpoint of universal human rights. And people who are broadly speaking on my side spent like a month yelling at me on Twitter because I wrote that article. So it's a little bit funny for Steven to be like, yeah, I'll bet Ben would support kicking out all the Israeli Jews. Like, I really wouldn't. Thank you. But this is not the only bit of mind reading along those lines he's going to do. We have another one waiting for us. But before we get to that one, let's do, because that one is like another string of them, and that'll probably be the one that it makes sense to end on for the main show. But yeah, let's do one other one, because there is a point that I really wanted to make about this, that like I was kind of befuddled by what was going on here at the time, right? But like thinking about it a little bit later, there is something that actually strikes me as pretty funny about this. So this is the right of return clip.
Legitimus says, Ben, should Pakistan be able to return their former homes in India or Germans to Western Poland?
Yes, to be sure. I think so. Yeah, I think that I'm always really shocked when people bring up the example of ethnic Germans in Eastern Europe, because of course this is one of Stalin's crimes, right? I mean, it's exactly the sort of thing that people have in mind when they think about Stalin's crimes, the mass deportation of entire ethnicities. In this case, ethnic Germans from parts of Eastern Europe that were at that point controlled by the Red Army. And it's a very strange sort of horseshoe that leads people to implicitly defend that for the sake of defending Zionism. But yes, I think in all of these cases, I would be against preventing that families that were removed by force and acts of ethnic cleansing from coming home. Of course, it's an easy question.
Well, just curious, do you know about the approximate numbers of people that were expelled, ethnic Germans from Europe? I think it was you don't have to have it, it's fine. It's almost like 20 million people. I don't know the descendants of that today. That would be an unbelievable. Also, I thought earlier we made the argument that the historical thing of who is expelled from where didn't actually matter. Because if that's the case, then why don't we just go back to the year, whatever, zero, when Israelis or Jewish people were expelled from the Middle East? Like, should everybody have the right to go back to every place they were ever expelled from ever? It just seems like completely, totally unworkable. Also, just as a heads up for the audience, apartheid, the core part of apartheid, it has nothing to do with not giving citizens or non-citizens the same right that citizens have. The textbook part about apartheid is racial domination. The motivation for apartheid, and by the way, this is a term that became somewhat generalized for some reason after it was used specifically and created specifically in South Africa. Racial domination means that you do not have Arab members that are part of your court. You do not have Arab members that are part of your Knesset, your parliament. You do not have Arabs that enjoy essentially the same rights and freedoms that you have in the entirety of your country. So no, the core part of apartheid has nothing to do with not giving rights to non-citizens, regardless of why those non-citizens might have been non-citizens.
It's the reason they're not citizens is because their ethnicity, just like Black South Africans weren't made citizens of South Africa.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, this idea that.
Insane.
Oh, sorry, you were saying, Ed.
I just said that was insane. Like, it's just, I mean, it's insane how we can't see that there is clear domination in Israel. It's just crazy that he can't see that the conditions of apartheid, inhuman treatment of a certain ethnic or racial group, like domination. And if you're gonna take the argument, well, there are Palestinians in a Supreme Court and there are Palestinians that have some power. Well, take it all the way and talk about the proportionality. I mean, if the amount of people in the Supreme Court, it's the amount of Muslims in the Supreme Court is 1 out of 12, which is, it's disproportionate. So if you're going to take that argument, take it all the way and say, well, at the very least, they're disproportionately not represented. And then just there's inhuman treatment of Palestinians in Israel in every way. And not even to mention the West Bank, which is kind of what the whole main point is, you know?
Yeah, totally. Right. And also, like, look, there were black congressmen in the United States in 1940. Right. Not a lot of them. Right. But there were some. Right. Because some of the states in which black people were allowed to vote elected black people to Congress. Nevertheless, I would say that the United States was an apartheid country in 1940. Right. Because there was a vast section of the United States where black people weren't allowed to vote because of their race. And even the parts where they were allowed to vote, you know, there was a lot of discrimination, et cetera, right? Like, but sure, yeah. I mean, the equivalent of members of the Knesset, right? And yeah, I suppose Thurgood Marshall didn't make it up to the Supreme Court until after the Civil Rights Act. But like, if those things had happened in the other order, I don't think that would have meant that there was racial equality in the U.S. So yeah, I think that's a great point, Aiden. And again, he's very hung up on this word racial, right? It was the same thing with, he's complaining about, being accused of what he said was racial essentialism. It's like, look, I don't really care what counts as a race, because I actually think race is a sort of weird fiction, right? Like that like there aren't like objective facts about who counts as what race, right? So it's like, just say ethnic, right? If you substitute ethnic for race, right, then yeah, ethnic domination, abso-fucking-lutely, right? I mean, you have millions of people who've been ruled over for 57 years. And the current official position of the Israeli government, this is what the prime minister says all the time, is that there will never, ever be a separate Palestinian state. But of course, they're also not going to make all these people citizens, right? So those millions of people have been denied citizenship precisely because if they became citizens, there would no longer be a Jewish majority and you would lose the Jewish character of the state, right? How is that not ethnic domination, right? Like, even apart from that kind of discrimination among people who are citizens of Israel that you're talking about. And of course, saying, oh, it's not apartheid because it's about citizenship is so bizarre, right? The whole point of apartheid, like the original instance of apartheid is it's became generalized later for some reason. It's like, well, how about because people were so rightly horrified by it that they wanted to think about what was so bad about that so they could also oppose it in other instances, right? And so that's why you have like the crime of apartheid under international law. But yeah, this is the way apartheid worked was that black people were considered to be citizens of these like legal fiction Bantustans rather than citizens of South Africa, right? So if you say, oh, it's not apartheid because it's about it's about citizens having more rights than non-citizens. Well, that's what the original apartheid was about too. But the reason I wanted to highlight this clip, the reason I thought it was funny, wasn't even about that. It was about the thing about Poland and ethnic Germans. So that 20 million figure he's citing is certainly high end. What I've seen since, and yeah, I certainly didn't have any of this on command, right? It wasn't anything I expected to talk about that night. But yeah, what I've seen since is it seems like usual estimates are about 12 to 14 million, not for Poland, but for like all of Eastern Europe. When those that ethnic cleansing happened of ethnic Germans at the end of World War II. And that also includes, like people who fled, from the Red Army, etc. But if you said, for the sake of argument, in this particular case, it would be unworkable because there are just too many people to let people come back after an ethnic cleansing. At the very least, you should see that as a tragedy, right? That's like, oh, you're in this like tragic dilemma where you can't do this thing that you would ordinarily have a really good reason to do on the basis of human rights because it would just be unworkable in this case. I don't think that gives you a good reason to just give up on the principle for every case, right? I think you could also have, compromise solutions, like you allow back a certain number every year, which by the way was Yasser Arafat's proposal in his, you can look it up in the New York Times. It's called The Palestinian Vision for Peace. In 2002, is Yasser Arafat's op-ed in the New York Times. He says, okay, we could admit like a limited number of refugees every year and address the demographic concerns that way. But also, like the thing that struck me about this later as I was thinking back to is like, Poland and Germany are both in the EU, right? They're both in what's it called, the Schengen zone. If you want to move from Germany to Poland, it's actually extremely easy. Right? Like you can pretty much you could pick up like tomorrow and like get like I'm pretty sure like a guaranteed like 90-day like residency and work permit, right? So if you want to live and work in Poland for a little while, you're certainly able to do so right now. You might not be able to get permanent residency, but you're surely if you've already been working there, you have connections there, like surely you're in a better position than somebody outside of the Eurozone would have to, the Schengen area in that case would have to do that. So, ethnic Germans are already way closer to having a right of return to Poland than Stephen may think here. But also, I don't think this is going to be a big logistical hangup. I don't think there are a lot of Germans who are like chomping in the bit to move to Poland. Like a lot of Poles want to move to Germany, right? And do, right? But other way around is much more rare. So it's just like, oh, this argument is so strange to me. Oh, if we grant a general, a sort of universal right of ethnic cleansing victims to come back to the area that they were removed from, that would be ridiculous because then, 100 gazillion, ethnic Germans would have a right to move back to Eastern European countries. It's like, I don't know. A lot of them are already in a pretty good position to right now, and they just don't want to. So because like Germany is a more prosperous country, right? So, yeah.
And if you do want to, make that argument, like when Israel was first founded in the Bible, it was they ethnically cleared out the Canaanites who are whose descendants are the Palestinians. So there go. You're right back where you started.
Well, the Palestinians, my understanding is probably from what we know about ancient Near Eastern archaeology, probably a lot of the Israelites, like the Israelite Canaanite distinction might not be as firm as it seems in the Bible, right?
Because Jewish people are also part Canaanite. So are quite a few countries.
In fact, probably lots of like Palestinians, Jewish descent, and also look, if you go back for long enough, the population, like thinking about how many times the population of the world has doubled, tripled, quadrupled, right? Over the millennia, and just running some very basic math about, about like how few people have to outmarry, right? For this to be true. Like, look, pretty much everybody who's alive today is descended from everybody who was alive a few thousand years ago. I mean, maybe outside of like that island where they're always shooting bow and arrows at missionaries, right? Maybe they're only descended from people who lived in that island a few thousand years ago. I'm not sure, but like, the rest of us are probably descended from, everybody. Okay. I know we're over time, but I do have one last string of clips that I want to show you guys because, again, there was some discussion here of the core issues, as hard as it was to kind of force things back to them. And also, although in a very strange way, right? Because my initial case at the beginning, right, opening statement was because Israel's been practicing apartheid since at least 1967, because there's been massive ethnic cleansing. I didn't use the G word because I didn't want us to spend all night parsing the legal definition of genocide, right? So I said at the very least ethnic cleansing, right? There's been at the very least massive ethnic cleansing in the last 9 months. So because of these things, it's wrong for the United States to support it, right? As Americans, we should be outraged that our government is supporting these things. That was my initial case. Destiny, though, I don't know if you guys know this. He has telepathic powers.
I've heard rumors.
And he looked into my head, and it didn't take him long to figure out that when I said that my conclusion was that the U.S. shouldn't be supporting this, what I really meant was something very different. So I think so we have 3 clips here. First one's regime change 1.
But the pro-Palestinian side generally just doesn't want to engage in any history because usually the history either makes them look bad or it undermines whatever current argument they're making. But even the modern understanding of what's happening in these regions is incredibly poor. The idea that we think that it is essential that all these leftists that constantly oppose regime change, we can't regime change Gaddafi, that's horrible. We can't regime change Saddam Hussein, that's horrible. We shouldn't be intervening in Syria, that's horrible. These places where you've got tortures of political opponents, where you've got the expulsion of enemy parties, the murders of journalists, where you've got the deaths of hundreds of thousands of other Arabs, none of these places are right for regime change because that would be unethical. But Israel, that's a place where, oh my God, like the apartheid, the genocide. If you ask the average person how many people have died in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they'd probably be shocked to learn that it's probably about half, of the Israeli-Arab conflict. If you add up every single war, every single massacre, every single conflict that happened between a Jewish person and an Arab person for the past 150 years, I think you're at about 1/2 to 1/3 of the total deaths of 6 years of the Syrian civil war. That doesn't include the Iraq-Iran war. That doesn't include everything that's happened in Iraq. It doesn't include the 60,000 some children that starved to death in Yemen, excluding all the other deaths. It doesn't include anything that's happened in Northern Africa. It doesn't include any of those other places. It's the amount of outrage that's given to this particular region, combined with the misunderstanding of history, combined with the misunderstanding of modern day facts, combined with the misunderstanding of international law, combined with the misunderstanding of basically every single part of this conflict, is so incredibly infuriating to me.
Yeah, he does a great job, reaching into your mind and understanding the depths of your soul.
Yeah. I mean, I have, I keep trying to get Jacobin to let me publish my Here's Why We Should Invade Israel article, and they keep not doing it. But, Steven knows. He can tell. So we have follow-up, number 2 out of 3 here.
Ben, the floor is yours.
Sure. So I just want to note that that started with a very strange attempt to find an inconsistency between opposing the United States going to war to impose regime change in various bad states with some of the same anti-war people opposing the United States actively helping a apartheid state carry out widespread ethnic cleansing. And you're right that if people who oppose the war in Gaza and the U.S. role in it, we're in favor, we're out there advocating that the United States invade Israel to impose regime change, then you're right, that would be very inconsistent. But of course, nobody has done that. Right? They're like that combination of positions, as far as I know. I'm sure you can always find somebody, but as far as I know, that combination of positions doesn't exist. So that seems like a very strange attempt to find inconsistency. But beyond that, I really just want to end by recentering us on the original topic, what the challenge was that was presented at the beginning of the debate, and whether that challenge was met. Right? So we're talking about should our country keep providing military and financial assistance and diplomatic cover to Israel no matter what? Or is it actually quite bad to provide military and financial assistance and diplomatic cover to an apartheid state? And is it in particular very bad to do that at a time when that state is carrying out atrocities against its non-citizen population with no precedent since the original Nakba? That's the big picture question. And so you should ask yourself, as immediately right when we started, Stephen redirected it to these completely off-topic questions and lingered in the details of those until we were done. But you should ask yourself, did you hear anything in all of that that answered any of those challenges? Do you think Stephen gave us a convincing argument to absolve Israel on the charge of apartheid? We were arguing about that for a minute. That's half of the sort of core original question. And then we were off again. And do you think that he's given us a convincing argument to absolve Israel on the charge of ethnic cleansing of its non-citizen subjects in Gaza over the course of the last 9 months? And if you think the answer is no, that nothing that he's said, whatever else you think he's right about, that nothing that he's said has added up to a convincing argument to absolve Israel on either of those points, do you then agree that it's a bad thing, a shameful thing, for the United States to support an apartheid state that's engaged in large-scale atrocities against its internal non-citizen population? And that's the whole deal. Everything else is noise.
I'm tempted to just go to the post game on that because that's actually, you know what? Hell, let's do that. We did have one more clip of this, but let's do it in the post game. I'm not going to be able to come up with a better sort of end note for the main show than that. So we're going to watch one last clip of this. In the post game, we are going to answer the important question that Mercutio asked in the chat. I suppose it's not a suggestion so much as it's a suggestion, right?
Yeah, I think it should be a Patreon level. Like if you donate $1,000 a month, you will have a date with Destiny.
Yes. Mercutio says, do a thrilling sequel, Ben and My Dinner with Destiny. Imagine the suspense. Will an appetizer be shared? Do they get dessert? Does Destiny leave a tip? Yeah. If, I don't know, once we get to 10,000 patrons, I'll agree to, I think Destiny lives in Miami at this point. I used to live in Miami. I'm sure we can come up with a restaurant that we both like. And, I'll do my best to actually make this happen and answer all these important questions. But in any case, we are going to do that. We are going to watch one last clip from this debate, and then as a palate cleanser, because honestly, I've already spent way more time than I like revisiting this extremely strange debate. Like, I'm going to do one on similar topics in a week or two with Walter Block, and I'm actually fully expecting that to be much less strange than this one with Destiny. Say what you want about Professor Block. I think I don't think we're going to spend half an hour talking about whether it's true that the U.S. trades with Israel, and can we establish a baseline on 20 irrelevant facts because they might come up in some way later in the conversation, and is it inconsistent to say that the U.S. applies leverage to make Israel more moderate, and that 1967 is evidence of that, but also 1967 was self-defense. I actually expect to have a entertaining perhaps, but a debate that is about the merits of the issue, which to a great extent this wasn't. I've actually been showing you the 1 and 2 minute clips scattered around the whole thing where we actually did talk about the core issue, which is this is not what most of this debate was like what I've been showing you. This is the good stuff from the debate. Most of it's just kind of tedious. But in any case, thank you, Mercutio. In any case, after we do one last clip in the post game, I am going to be ready to stop talking and thinking about Destiny for a while. This has been, preparing for the debate, doing the debate, getting the clips ready for tonight has been a amount of thinking about this guy that I dislike doing. And, I'll do it again when we do that 10,000 patrons, dinner in Miami that we're somehow going to get him to agree to. So, but until then, I don't really want to do it. So as a palate cleanser, we're going to watch Jimmy Dore, and Candace Owens. If nothing else, right, there's a yin and yang here that, we just watched Destiny say a bunch of weird essentialist, neo-colonialist kinds of things about Palestinians for a couple hours. Now we're going to switch gears and watch the Jimmy Dore Candace Owens Anti-Semitism Festival of 2024. A little balance there. But
sometimes it's nice to watch some real anti-Semitism to know what it actually looks like. You know what I mean? So the hope that will be the goal of the post game, to remind folks that it's not criticizing Israel's policies. It's we're gonna really see what it looks like. Really,
just to remind yourself what the real version is, that this isn't just a word that people came up with to smear people for criticizing Israel. Looking forward to that. Oh, we have Hadrian of Theseus is anticipating the Walter Block debate, but as I said, that's not going to be for another week or two probably. But in any case, we have all that coming up. If you are a patron, you should have a link to the post game already in your inbox. If you are not a patron, there's no better time than now to get your life together and become one. So that's patreon.com/Ben Burgis. We have, this is, if you like what we're doing, right, this is what, everybody, well, Aiden's an intern, but I bought him lunch. Everybody else on the screen, right, this is part of how they're making their living. So if you like what we're doing, then please do consider becoming a patron. You get various benefits, access to the Discord server. Sometimes we do things in the Discord, like the debate watch party last Thursday. We've done movie nights. We actually did one of those with TIR last Friday. Sometimes you get early access to things. Every Monday and Thursday you get the patron exclusive post game after the regular show, all of which are just ways of saying thank you. The real thing is just, again, if you like what we're doing, helps us do it. So all joking aside, thank you for those of you who do. And those of you who do, we will see in about 90 seconds. Left is best.